we will develop closer to what we need to achieve in the end.
Just to clarify my question, like, is resistance for you directed at oppression or directed against capitalism?
Those two things are linked. Those two things can, especially in this country, they can't be untwined. They can't be not linked. Racism and capitalism are intertwined in the United States. They were you built this imperialist, capitalist empire on the bones and blood of human bodies, black bodies, and they wiped out red bodies by the millions. So the oppression, the patriarchy, and the racism is intertwined in capitalism in the United States. You can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
Can we stop calling black bodies and red body? I just think it's a little gross to like call people bodies. Like it's a little odd. I think everything you said about left unity is basically correct, and I think we can have, an actual sort of awakening, I guess you could say, of people by educating them and so on. But the problem is that just resisting Trump is not sufficient to do that. And the other problem is the Revolutionary Communist Party is certainly not going to be the leadership of that revolution if it comes. So,
whatever the antidote to fascism is, and let's just concede for the sake of argument that Trump is a fascist, whatever the antidote to fascism is, it's not a Leninist cult. And let's be very clear about that.
I still haven't heard you guys actually address anything about the RCP. You haven't said anything about their actual lines. You haven't said anything about their politics. It's been all at the level of accusing them of being a cult on the basis of of the style of their politics and their organization. It seems like a fetishization of me I see the problem that both organizations like yours, which are almost pathologically unable to build up leadership, and at the same time organizations like the RCP, who evolve in these sort of organizations that can't get beyond their leadership and can't develop new leadership. I see them as actually part of the same problem, that these are problems of Bonapartism. There isn't a difference. We encounter this in Germany all the time, where you have Marxists who refuse to have leaders to their organizations because the word for Marxist for leader is Führer, and so you cannot have a leader, right? How do you actually mediate the problem of essentially authoritarianism without an actual development of tensions within an organization that nevertheless do not impede its growth in terms of the development of an organized line?
The RCP is a cult.
So, well, to answer the question, firstly, I don't think that there can be a distinction made between an organization's politics and its political structure. As members of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, we hold that the means must justify the ends and the ends must justify the means. In other words, if we're to achieve an egalitarian society of equals, we need to have an organization of equals. Okay, so I don't understand the distinction really. To me, we fundamentally, and what the party line. The party line is defined by the party membership. We come together in the Socialist Party of Great Britain because we believe in the goals of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. If I stopped believing in the goals of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, I wouldn't be in the Socialist Party of Great Britain. If I did stop believing in the goals of the Socialist Party of Great Britain and I tried to carry on being a member of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, I'd quite reasonably be kicked out of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Okay? So you can organise within the party politically, and you can have a structure within the party without having leadership. If you can lead the working class into revolution, then someone can come up again and just lead them straight out again, like Stalin did, okay? If you want socialism as a long-term solution, as a definite final end of humanity, the working class have to get there themselves, and that has to be reflected in the structure of a socialist political party.
I fully agree with that, and if you believe that that we have no leadership in the IWW, tell that to the prisoners who are currently getting led by each other into a strike for their own basic rights. Tell that to everybody. The elections for the IWW were just recently. We elected people literally called the leadership. It's a question of, do we have leadership that's from the bottom up, or do we have leadership that's from the top down? And as for whether or not the RCP is a cult, I don't know how we got dragged this far into this conversation. I think it's a little counterproductive, but I will say when I went to their bookstore, they had some awesome books. I bought the People's Guide to American History, the Howard Zinn book, something like that.
Well, I'd just like to say
The
I came
People's
into
History
contact with the
of the United States.
RCP at Revolution Books in Boston when I was in college, and I got to sit right next to Howard Zinn and have a discussion about
Wait,
the people's history of the
wait.
United States. So I
The
agree with
problem, the problem I saw was that they kept pushing Bob Avakian's, I think they called it The Basics, and it was like a book of, they called it the new synthesis that he has
Did you read it?
synthesized.
Did you disagree with it? How did you
I
disagree
looked
with it?
through it. There was nothing really
you.
remarkable
No, you
about
didn't. You
anything
didn't read
in
it.
it.
You haven't
There's-
read
there's
it, and
not
you haven't
really-
read it. So again, there is not.
Tell me where.
I
Tell
know
me where
people who
Bob
are in the
Avakian's
I know
new
people who are in the
synthesis is
RCP,
different
and
from
there's not
anything.
one single person in the RCP in this fucking building right now. And you guys have dragged it into this thing because, yes, just as in the red baiting from the Reds or from the left, you know, is really pathetic. It's really, and it shows you actually where you stand because we're looking at what we're facing in this country was nothing like we've ever faced in this country before up to this point, period. As a society, now you can not black people, and the reason why I say black bodies is because that's the way the oppressor is treating them and looking at them. When you shove thousands of Africans into a slave ship, you think they're calling them African American friends and family? No, they're
Why are
looking
we
at them as
calling
black
them
bodies.
what the slave owners called them?
I'm
that's
mocking them,
odd.
dude. I'm not calling. I don't go around. My kids are black. I'm not going around calling. Hey, bring your black body over here. You know, that's a stupid. This is a stupid point, man. I mean, come on. You don't hear the context in which I'm saying it. When, like, Mike Brown's body lying in the rotting in the middle of the street, the way Jeff Sessions looks at black people, those are just their bodies to them. Not to me. I don't go around calling them that. I hope that's clear to people here. Do you guys understand that? Okay, thank you.
We should bracket the question of the cult issue and move forward and think about the focus of the panel.
So my question's for Ted. I really don't know much about ResistFascism, and so this is more maybe it's on one of those pamphlets actually. Here, I'll grab one now. Thanks. But my question is, let's say the Trump regime is fascist. We don't need to argue about that definition right now for this idea. You were just saying that the ResistFascism itself is not calling for a revolution, but rather to try to get people out into the streets. Of course, the goal seems to be the removal of the Trump regime from political power, right? But you said also that the people don't seem to be ready for a revolution. I guess I'm slightly curious about like the timeline. Trump has 2 more years of this term. He might win the next term. Is it looking more like 10, 20 years down the road there might be a revolutionary potential, or is the hope that somehow the Trump regime will be arrested, removed from office some way through political means? I guess I'm just curious about kind of the basics of that.
Well, you know, we feel that this regime represents a grave threat to all of the planet and humanity. So has the United States represented a grave threat to the planet for many, you know, for a couple centuries now. But this is the next level thing, you know, and what we can do right now is we can unite as broadly as possible. Like Gus said, I mean, again, this goes down to the insanity of this argument. I met Gus in the streets. We don't agree on elections. We don't agree on, he works with all sorts of organizations I would never waste my time with. But Gus deals with the situation at hand and what we're facing, and we've united and we work together. and we know where we stand. I might give him a ride to home or whatever, and we'll argue about this crap and about the Electoral College, and then maybe you can get rid of Senate the way that they, by the way, we have all these institutions that are reinforcing this system that were created to justify and uphold the slave system. That's why we have Donald Trump in power. You have the Electoral College, you have 2 senators from Wyoming, you have 2 senators from California. You have a structure that was built in order to maintain and perpetuate a slave system, and that's still in place. So there's structural things within this society where maybe you don't have to turn into Hitler and bring the brown shirts out everywhere, but you see that the votes and the gerrymandering and everything and the way that they've clamped down on the courts and the way that they're infiltrating the police, there's already tons of white supremacist organizations within the army, within the police forces. There's militias all over this country that are ready to be activated in a fascist clampdown when it gets to that point. Again, in Nazi Germany, it didn't start. Kristallnacht was 1938. That's 5 years. Look what Trump's done in 2 years, less than 2 years. And tell me, ho-hum, it's the same old, same old. Let's talk about Bill Clinton, who Bill Clinton raped today. So I'm sorry, did I not quite get to it? Right, so we need to get in the streets. We need to talk. We need to debate this out, But we need to stop this, because if we don't stop this, it's going to get much worse.
Yeah, my question is more basically like, who's doing it? Like, who will do? Who will be the people who accomplish the tasks of refuse fascism?
I don't know if you saw what's happening in Romania last week too. Two nights in a row, 40,000 people were out, demanding the resignation of their corrupt regime. We've been saying refuse fascism from day one. This is an illegitimate regime. Why? Because they're fascists. And we see that they're making these moves and I'm no big personal fan of the neoliberal capitalist imperialist system in the United States. In fact, I spent my whole life fighting against it. But other people that work with refuse fascism might have posters of Barack Obama on their wall. Well, right now we have to unite and we have to push back the scourge. And it's not just happening here, it's happening all over the world. And, talk about being a socialist and not talking about these struggles. And, we don't think about ourselves as a worldwide class anymore. Or, we're talking about our country and this shit is going down, and they're organizing and they're coming and they're coalescing and they're coming together and they're shattering norms and rewriting the rules and putting their judges in power, and they're clamping down. And, to me, that's not ho-hum capitalism. Oh, it's, it's the same old, same old. To me, that whole attitude is like, I knew the band before they were popular. I mean, I knew the band when nobody knew them, and now everyone knows them. So no, we're facing this fucking threat, which is exaggerated from anything we've seen up to this point. We need to respond accordingly.
So you're appealing a lot to norms, and I've never met a Marxist who appeals to the norms of the capitalist political system as a basis for their movement.
Legitimacy, illegitimacy.
Yeah.
This is a very bourgeois way of thinking, I have to say.
Again, I'm here speaking on behalf of Refuse Fascism, and then also I represent myself. Okay? So yes, these norms are important to keep in mind, because the shattering of these norms mean that the weak institutions that have been set in place, and some of the things that we've won through the struggles of people getting their heads bashed in at lunch counters and getting their heads bashed in on buses and being murdered and lynched, have won some recessions in this system over the course of time. And most of those came through the struggles of the 50s and the 60s. The rights even for women to vote from the 20s. Okay, these weren't things that were voted into place. These were things that were struggled for and won with the sacrifice and blood of people. And now these meager concessions are not enough, or they're not even come close enough. But so we should just let them sweep them away. And I'm not sure why you have to look at him when you're just asking me a question.
No, I'm just saying after Joe's follow-up, let's move on to the next question.
I'm struck by how well. I like the honesty of your comments, Ted, because it does feel like what we've all expressed here is that we are, by some sort of necessity of the moment, by the sort of complete collapse of any sort of coherent leftist project, that we are all forced upon this like resistance that cannot articulate any sort of reformism, that cannot articulate anything revolutionary that could spring from reforms, that we aren't even at a place where we can imagine a reform working towards that, even within the DSA. The DSA is just electing progressives as though that's a way of constituting reforms, which we know from history it isn't, just because they call themselves socialists, right? And I'm not saying that I'm, special in this regard, because the activism that I've done over the last several years, I find myself doing the same thing, falling back on smaller and smaller, less ambitious projects, just trying to get the ball rolling with respect to organizing a few people around something that they care about, right? In the hopes that they might learn something about politics so that they can at least think about the problem of capitalism and how its dimensions are beyond our comprehension precisely because there is no left. I guess that's the answer to the question that we sort of like dropped off about the question of what capitalism really is and what we could say about like things like social media and what they mean to us in terms of capitalism, is that there's so many things in the contemporary world that we cannot understand precisely because we haven't constituted capitalism as a problem. That's something that the left used to do. If there was a coherent fascism or a coherent imperialism in the early 20th century, it's because the left constituted it as a problem through its activity. Without a left, then it's just nonsense. That's why there is the problem of whether there is an organized working class is important. I'm not saying that people should stop struggling, but that also doesn't mean that we like jettison the articulation. I mean, this was brought up also from the audience, like the question of like educating people about the nature of capitalism is itself something that gets left in the wayside when we just run around saying like Marxism and fascism and like labor union struggles are like the solution that we have to like pursue without actually thinking about the problems that are involved in that and how like we're actually at a degraded point where we can't actually think about them. Like it's actually become sort of a chicken egg problem. I'm just like wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, so I think you maybe answered this question a little bit already, but there's been like a lot of debate about whether we call Trump's presidency fascism or whether it's just like capitalism going as normal. I don't know whether I'm just like missing the obvious in asking this question, but what hangs on that? Like what practical implications does that have for us? Like what's kind of motivating the vehemence of this disagreement? Like yeah, and that's for anyone.
I mean, just to like, we'd have to, this is why talking about history is so important, because the issue with fascism was precisely its relationship to the organization of the revolution. It was the question of like, initially you had Trotsky being accused by the Stalinists of being a social fascist, because he was trying to work with the socialists, the social democrats, to fight against fascism in the 20s, right? Once it was too late, or at least once Trotsky had decided it was too late, the left opposition had, the Stalinists went in the 30s and said, well, now we have to unite with the rest of the left in a popular front, right? And Trotsky's like, well, actually, this is like beyond the point of actually being, you can't save Germany. Maybe you can't save Europe. You know, maybe all we can do in the face of World War II is prepare for the possibility of a revolutionary situation similar to World War I. I don't agree with that judgment necessarily. It definitely turned out to be a dud, historically speaking, in terms of a project. But there are these sorts of questions that hinge on, like, for instance, the question of the meaning of the Soviet Union with respect to politics internationally. Sorry, it's a funny gesture. So, and the question of the Soviet Union, for instance, with respect to, like, Trotsky's analysis of the necessity of revolution within Russia, right? Understanding the Soviet Union as itself symptomatic of the same problems that were confronting fascism in Germany, that were at issue in Germany. In other words, that Bonapartism was also an issue in fascism, in the Soviet Union, as well as in the New Deal, that these were not isolated, different phenomena, that you couldn't just say, this is liberal, this is fascist, and that's socialist, that they were all interrelated in some manner, that the authoritarianism of the period was actually grounded in the organization of the working class and in the jettisoning of the project that they had started out against. That, in other words, that the problem of fascism only ever came about because the working class actually tried to change the world. All right, that itself is something that the people don't actually talk about when they talk about fascism. It also becomes this thing that comes from outside. It's the they. It's the aggressors that are part of the ruling class that are like inflicting this upon us, or it's like the misled elements of like certain classes. But it's never like actually the working class made this a thing, and it only became a thing because the working class and the organized apparatus of the working class, the vanguard of the working class, were not actually able to lead the project that they started out on.
I mean, I think the question about whether Trump is a fascist or just a continuation of things, that's your question. I think it hinges on whether we organize around defeating Trump or we organize around defeating capitalism and making more socialists, basically.